No fireworks to begin July, at least here in the tropics, but will it remain this quiet for long, and what can we expect over the course of the month of July? Our entire Tracking the Tropics team is live with the very latest and to answer your questions in a Meteorologist QA coming your way on Tracking the Tropics, powered by Handyman Roofing. Hey there, folks. JB Buno here with you live in your hurricane headquarters. Happy 4th of July after the fact to those of you, of course, who we missed on our last edition of Tracking the Tropics. Great to have, of course, Tracking the Tropics meteorologist Rebecca Barry joining us there in the top right. And in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen, our featured meteorologist today, WDHN Chief Meteorologist Matthew Wine, joining us from Dothan, Alabama. You can use any of the hashtags on your screen. We'll be featuring them, of course, your questions in a Meteorologist Q&A coming up here in just a short while. But for the very latest, let's send things over to Chief Meteorologist Jeff Biridelli for the very latest. Hey there, Jeff.
Hey, JB, and hey to all of you at home. Talk about quiet weather in the tropics. It is very quiet right now across basically all the basins, although the Pacific is heating up because we had Bonnie that moved in, and I'll show you that. That, of course, came from the Atlantic, which is crazy, right? All right, so take a look right now. Across the Atlantic Ocean, nice and quiet in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and in the deep tropical Atlantic. We call that the main development region. And as we go to the Pacific, this was Bonnie. It still is Bonnie because it crossed over. It maintained its core, maintained its integrity. It had developed in the very southern part of the Caribbean, about as far south as a system can possibly develop. It crossed right over Central America, and now it's located here. It's a strong Cat 2, borderline Cat 3 hurricane in the eastern Pacific Ocean. It's not too often that a system passes straight over Central America. It's barely impacted, and then it strengthens on the other side. It happens every once in a while. It happened with Bonnie. The rest of the Atlantic is super quiet, so development is not expected over the next 5 days. Saharan dust. So we have a pretty good chunk of Saharan dust that's coming off of Africa right now, moving through the Cape Verde Islands, and this is going to be traversing the Atlantic. We'll take you through Tuesday. You can see that all that dust is going to be making its way into the Caribbean. So we're not really expecting much development, but there's another reason for it. It's not just Saharan dust. I'll step out of this picture for you just for a second to show you this. So this is something we call the Madden-Julian oscillation. It is essentially a sub-seasonal oscillation, and it helps us to predict exactly how active a time period will be. We can usually look out about a month or so and know where there is sinking air in the basins and where there's rising air in the basins. And we have sinking air all across the United States, northern part of South America, and all across the tropical Atlantic. Lots of rising air in what we call the maritime continent, which is Asia, all the way down through Indonesia and Australia. You've probably heard about all the flooding in Sydney over the past couple of days. That is part of the reason, and also La Nina, which we're about to talk about as well. Well, this sinking air is going to be with us straight through the end of July. I'm not really expecting much of any development, at least for the next 2 weeks plus. As we enter August, though, of course, that's when we would typically see season pick up. At the exact same time, we're going to see a little bit more rising air move our way. This rising air across Asia right now is a lot of rising air. It's going to weaken substantially by the time it gets to us, but we will be under rising and not sinking air. That's what's important. So as we head towards the end of July and beginning of August, we should start to see a little bit more activity. Now, we've been talking about this in all the Tracking the Tropics episodes, but La Nina is still ongoing. We've seen a little bit of a warm-up here, which would be good. We want an El Nino, right? Or we want warmer temperatures in the eastern Pacific. That precludes development to some degree in the Atlantic. Problem is now we've just seen a trade wind surge across the Pacific Ocean. In fact, one of the strongest trade wind surges that we've seen this time of year, and that's going to bolster La Nina, meaning we're going to end up with cool water again in the tropical Pacific as we head into the peak of hurricane season, which probably means it's going to enhance activity across the Atlantic. And in the Atlantic, we have warm water in the Gulf, the Caribbean, and also in the deep tropical Atlantic. Let's talk a little bit more about why La Nina is about to be enhanced. We have this easterly trade wind surge, and that means cool water across the central part of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. And watch what happens. I kind of turn this map on its side. When you have this surge of winds that are out of the east, it leaves kind of a vacuum. It kind of pushes the water out, and that water has to be replaced from somewhere, so it upwells in the eastern Pacific Ocean, and it tends to create even more cool water, and that enhances La Nina. And of course, you know La Ninas produce about 3 times the number of hurricanes that El Ninos do. And so we don't want a La Nina, but it looks like we're going to have one as we head into the peak of hurricane season. Also, of course, water temperatures are warm. That means low wind shear as well across the Atlantic basin. Now, Rebecca Barry did this analysis for me. I'll step out of the picture so you can see it. Where are we this year compared to last year and the year before? Of course, 2020, the most active season in terms of the number of storms. And, 2020 was way ahead of the pace that we're at now. And even last year, ahead of the pace that we're at now. Now, we, of course, are ahead of normal pace right now with already 3 systems under our belt. But it's not as active so far as it was last year or the year before. This is the hurricane season forecast, both from NOAA and also Colorado State. Both forecasting an above normal season. Our average is 14. Both of those outlets forecasting up to 20 storms. CSU is coming out with their next forecast this Thursday, so we'll see if they update their forecast. European model had forecast something like 21 named storms in its last cycle. Its newest cycle a couple days ago forecast 15 storms. So that is also a sign that maybe it's not going to be quite as active as we thought maybe a month ago, but that remains to be seen. Just a couple more things I want to show you, and then we'll bring in the whole team. So where do storms typically form this time of year? So basically the middle 2 weeks in July. And there's some in the Gulf, some in the Caribbean. The majority of them actually just off the eastern seaboard, off of places like Georgia, places like North Carolina and South Carolina, and the eastern seaboard around Bermuda. And a few systems form in the deep tropical Atlantic. That becomes a lot more active as we head towards August. And the peak of hurricane season, of course, in the middle of September here, September 10th to be exact. We are still at the very, very beginning of hurricane season. Okay, so I want to bring in Matthew. Matthew, let's talk about what you wanted to talk about, which is obviously storm surge, one of the biggest threats from hurricanes, but not just storm surge, the inland threat that you see in Dothan, Alabama from tornadoes.
Absolutely. So you hit it right on the head. The storm surge is the biggest threat for, of course, the coastline, but it doesn't go too far inland unless you're in exceptionally low-lying areas like over New Orleans. Of course, much of southeast Louisiana there was absolutely demolished by Hurricane Katrina years and years ago. It's because it was an exceptionally low-lying area. But you get storm surge to move inland, and it can be a 6, 12, 20-foot storm surge in some places. I think that Katrina was even higher than that. And so you add that on to, of course, when it comes to these low-lying coastlines, it's going that wind just pushes these waves inland, and that's the most deadly, the most costly portion of a hurricane as well. So, but for us up here in Dothan, we're 75 to 80 miles inland, so our threat is primarily the gusty winds, but really the tornadoes. In fact, Ida, back at the end of August of last year, that one, the center of low pressure way to the north of us, but it spun up 3 tornadoes within, I think, a 7-mile diameter in one of our counties. So again, tornadoes is really what we're so focused on. You can see with this graphic here that Rebecca put together, that rotating column of air. Usually we see these things happen with fronts or supercellular storms, but a hurricane is its own big system, and it can create this weather on its own because, again, it's just such a large system and it has its own spin. And as it is throwing these outer rain bands around itself, that aids in helping get these columns of air to start twisting. Good news is that tornadoes inside of hurricanes usually significantly weaker than tornadoes that are supercellular or come from a supercellular storm. And there's usually a specific spot that these happen in, and it's that right front quadrant. Now, a lot of people think spot number 2, that looks like the right front, right? When you look directly at the map, but in fact, you have to take into account the storm motion. This is heading basically due east, according to this graphic right here. So it's heading to the western side of Florida, not up the western side, but directly into the western side. So that right front quadrant is actually number 1. So Naples would be the area, in Fort Myers, those are the areas that would get the worst of the storm surge and likely the highest impact possibility from tornadoes as well. So that would be the spot that I would say is going to have the worst of the weather. But if you're in quadrant number 2 there, those winds are coming around the storm and back out toward the ocean. So a lot of places are going to, especially north of that, aren't going to have nearly as bad of storm surge, and that's a huge thing. So local meteorologists are going to be the ones that break that down for you. But I want to take, and I don't think that we can zoom in here, but if you look at Tampa and St. Petersburg, that area right there, obviously I'm not a local, you guys are, and you would be able to speak on this more than me. But in this situation, if I were just taking a quick look, I would say Tampa doesn't look too bad. I know that there is a bay just next to Tampa. It starts with an M. I can't remember what it's called. That water may be able to be pushed a little bit further west into Tampa itself, but really it would be St. Petersburg, because I think that Tampa Bay is on the eastern side of St. Petersburg, and there's more water there for that to be pushed through the eastern half of St. Petersburg. I don't know if you guys have any walls along the coastline to help keep the water out on the bay side. No walls?
No walls.
Yeah, so this would not be a good situation for them. You would think, oh, well, the storms south of us were good. Well, St. Petersburg itself, I think, would probably be in the worst spot when it comes to any area, any city within the Tampa Bay area there. But those that are actually all along the actual coastline of the Gulf, further west of St. Petersburg, they would be much more in the clear of storm surge because those winds would be pushing more of that water a little bit further away as opposed to inland. So again, in this situation, storm surge would be really bad for Fort Myers and Naples, and it would be a little bit less so further north unless you've got a bay right next to you, which would put St. Petersburg in that risk area. So this is why it is so important. A lot of people say, well, I can check my phone and I can see the alerts on my phone that National Weather Service puts out and those sort of things. You really need a local meteorologist to break this down for you. And that's why we always encourage people to tune into TV and check on that latest forecast in these situations.
So speaking of, let's bring JB back in and let's bring Rebecca back into the conversation. I know there's lots of viewer questions that we would like to introduce and answer for you.
Yeah, let's start our Meteorologist Q&A with Matthew, Jeff, and Rebecca. You can use a hashtag to ask a question. Of course, we'll begin here with one of the ones in our Facebook Live comment section. We'll start with Dan Evans. Hashtag, hey Matthew, why did the majority of storms form off the coast of Africa? I've always wondered why.
All right, I'm not a perfect hurricane expert here. And so you guys, JB, you guys can all help tune in, Rebecca and Jeff. But obviously we need those tropical waves. They typically come from Africa, but so does something else, and it's the Saharan dust. So sometimes what comes off of Africa is a tropical wave that can form into something. And I can't remember exactly what time of year that those typically happen really far east in the Atlantic. Can you guys remember?
You mean when do we see an uptick in the seedlings or those tropical waves that come off Africa?
Yes.
You know, I mean, they've been happening, but they don't really become robust and they don't really have the ability to form until usually the middle of August, sometimes earlier than that. We just saw one. Bonnie was an African wave, but it was also a very unusually odd, conducive situation across the Atlantic for like a window of a week, and it just happened to be pushing through during that week.
Yeah, but a lot of times they start even closer to the Cape Verde Islands. Was Hurricane Matthew one of those that had that long trek? I think it was.
We watched Matthew for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we didn't know if it was going to be a West Coast storm or an East Coast storm there for a little while, just based on its trajectory. It does feel like it later in the season is when we
October,
get those long tracking, long formats, you know, where you're just watching it. It's basically a hurricane 2 days after it leaves Africa, and you're just waiting and waiting and waiting.
Yeah, Matthew was October, but what's interesting is it ended up, thank goodness it was October, because if it was a week or two earlier, it probably would have slammed right into the east coast of Florida. If you remember, it just kind of grazed West Palm Beach, it grazed Cape Canaveral, and then it moved north. It would have just slammed right into Florida. In October, we have these stronger westerly winds, which is why we get a lot of our big storms in Tampa during October. Because when systems come up through the Gulf, they tap into that stronger west wind during the fall, and it just pushes everything our way. So for us, I worry most about September, October here in our area.
How about this question coming in for Brenda? We'll send this one Rebecca's way. It's Brenda Unkenbacher, hashtag hey JB. I live in Lithia, Florida. What would be my chances of being in a big hurricane? Always the most popular question. Is a big hurricane going to hit my neighborhood, where I live, where I go to work, where I walk my dog? What do you say, Rebecca?
Well, unfortunately, the science is not quite there for us to put a number on it or a percentage of a chance for you that you would get hit on a particular year by a big hurricane. The chances are relatively low. Despite how active a season is, unfortunately, all it takes is one storm for it to be a bad season for you if it ends up affecting you and your home. The chances of getting a major hurricane are relatively low, but not non-existent. The science isn't there yet where we could predict where the major hurricanes will be headed at a particular season. We have good ideas of where they form based on the month and based on the overall steering currents and the overall weather patterns, and we have a good idea of where they head based on historic tracks, as well as the fact that we track things like the Bermuda High, because that's a big steering current for storms during the season. And so earlier in the season, they get slung into the Gulf as that high pressure tracks a little bit further north. They get slung into the Atlantic, and then as those westerly winds pick back up late in the season, like Jeff was just talking about, that's when if any systems that do enter the Gulf end up heading closer to Florida or closer to the Panhandle because of those greater overall weather patterns that we're used to. Unfortunately, the science just isn't quite there for me to say you have a 37% chance in Lithia.
I want to ask Jeff this question, and Matt and Rebecca, you guys can chime in on this as well. We just saw in that graphic that going from July into August, we see that biggest increase in tropical activity. What is the number one factor that drives that massive increase from July into August? Because it's not even just a small little baby increase. It is a monumental, massive increase based on the graph that we were just looking at, Jeff.
Well, it's a bunch of things. So Matthew just talked about one of them, which is this increase in tropical waves off of Africa. So essentially the African monsoon and how active it is and how wet it is in any given season in Africa determines about how active or inactive the Atlantic will be. So it's not just La Nina and El Nino, it's also what's happening in Africa. So that's the first thing. We see more of them as we head into August and September. But the bigger story is that a couple of things happen out in the Atlantic. First of all, it warms up, so those tropical waves have a better chance of keeping their energy as they come across. In addition, there's less Saharan dust. Our Saharan dust season is right now, so June, July, and then it really quiets down as we head into August, so there's less dust. The atmosphere isn't as dry and isn't as stable. And because of that, by the way, because there's less dust, there's more sun that's able to penetrate into the Atlantic here and warm it up even more. And then in addition, we start to lose the strong shear that exists across the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a graveyard this time of year. If you remember, I showed you that graphic where the climatology for these 2 weeks, where most storms form, they form off the eastern seaboard. They almost never form in the Caribbean. It's the graveyard this time of year because the wind shear is really strong and because there's lots of dry air and Saharan dust. So everything just improves as we head towards, the peak of season, which is the beginning, or excuse me, really it starts in the middle of August, but it could be the beginning of August, through September into the beginning of October.
I know that water temperatures play a factor in this, so Rachel is asking in our comment section, #HeyJeff. Again, our comment featuring is powered by Handyman Roofing. She asks, the Gulf at 90 degrees still or hotter now, Jeff?
Well, it depends on where you are. It's 89 at Clearwater Beach right now, but certain pockets of the Gulf certainly over 90, and the deeper parts of the Gulf, closer to 86 degrees.
Matt, if you were heading to the beach, where are you hitting up? Panama City Beach? Are you going to Baldwin County, like Orange County, not Orange County, Orange Beach? Gulf Shores, are those some of the beaches you're heading to?
Actually, my favorite place, I went there every single year growing up. We've got family friends that have a beach house there. St. George Island is my favorite place in the whole wide world. I'd live there if I could, beg my dad to buy a beach house, but those are expensive and I didn't quite realize it at the time when I was younger. So that's where I go, and I actually just went there this weekend. We had a little rain, obviously no tropical systems. But they fared really well actually in Michael. I was very worried. I was in Hawaii at the time on a research trip, and Michael was passing through and obviously did a lot of damage in Panama City, but specifically Mexico Beach. And I thought that it was going to go just a little bit further east and hit St. George. And I was so worried that whole island would just be toast. And so obviously I've got a personal connection, not just, I like vacationing at the beach, but that is literally my favorite place in the world. And so thinking that it was going to be wiped off, it was good news. And my uncle was like, no, everything's still there. We're all good. But I did want to mention the sea surface temperatures that you were talking about in the Gulf. Jeff hit it on the head that it depends on where you're at in the Gulf, how deep the water is, how shallow. Obviously, the shallower it is, the warmer it could very well potentially be at certain parts in the season. But there's something called the loop current, and that was a big factor, I believe, in the formation of Hurricane Katrina, correct? Because it went over the peninsula of Florida and was a Category 1, I think, when it first made landfall on the eastern side. Then it went into the Gulf, and it hit that loop current that had that deep, extra warm water at the end of August. And that's part of the reason that it exploded to a Cat 5 and then weakened as it was moving further inland closer to Louisiana as a Category 3 because that water wasn't quite as warm. And I'm sure that there were other interactions as well. But that loop current moves around in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's, again, why meteorologists have to take apart every single aspect here to determine the strength of these storms as they're moving from one area to another.
Yeah, I don't know if you read that article, Matthew, about the loop current to scientists down at University of Miami, and I happened to interview him before the season began for our hurricane special. His name's Nick Shea, and he says, first of all, that the loop current looks a lot like it did in 2005. He brought up Katrina. Mm-hmm. He said it's deeper than it typically is this time of year. It's warmer than it typically is this time of year. He also talked about Hurricane Ida. Was that last year or the year before?
That was last year.
Last year. And how Ida got a big jolt from the loop current. and how he believes that the water temperatures in the loop current were aided by, global warming. And by 20%, actually. He says that he believes the water was about 20% warmer than it otherwise should have been. So in any event, he just, that's his primary area of study is the loop current. And he had a lot of interesting stuff to say about how important it is not to just have surface water that's really warm, but deep warm water to constantly be replenishing that warm water at the surface when it gets eaten away and used up by hurricanes as they move through.
Yeah. It's very interesting when we get these sea surface temperature maps and we see a storm go over an area, how much cooler that water is behind it, because it took all of that latent energy to help strengthen that storm. So hopefully something I get to show this year with our weather graphics.
And the episode that Jeff is referencing, all of our episodes, everybody, all of our conversations on Tracking the Tropics are on trackingthetropics.tv. We encourage all of our fellow weather nerds out there to go give it a look, go give it a watch. Guys, before we wrap up this episode, let me just kind of go around the horn here. Jeff, we'll start with you, and then we'll go around and we'll end on Matthew. The bottom question on our screen is, how long is this going to last? The quiet tropics that we have right now, of course, I think that we saw no development expected in the next 5 days was a graphic that Jeff and Rebecca had earlier on. But how long do we expect it to be this quiet? Because last week's episode, we were talking about 3 storms being out there, or 3 areas that they were tracking, the NHC I'm referencing, obviously. But when will things start to pick up, or when will things no longer be quiet, Jeff?
I love this question, because when we were tracking 3 things in the Atlantic, we knew that 1 week from now, we'd be tracking nothing. And that's because we've become really good at forecasting essentially the climate out 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks out now, using something called the MJO, which I showed you, the Madden-Julian oscillation. It's really helpful to know when we're going to see these upticks in activity and when we're going to see these lulls. And we do know that we're under a lot of sinking here. It would take a lot to get one of these systems to develop. Now, could it? Of course. We could see something just kind of come off the eastern seaboard here, right there, and just spiral up, in this area. That could easily happen. But we think it's going to be quiet for the next 2, possibly 3 weeks. And then, if the predictions for the phase of the Madden-Julian oscillation pan out, then by the end of July and the beginning of August, we'll start to see activity pick up again.
And Rebecca, we haven't really talked too much about Colin, about how Colin formed out of nowhere. It just goes to show how unpredictable sometimes the tropics can be.
And that plays into what I was thinking about this. Colin formed over land over the Carolinas and looked better than Arthur did at some points. Yeah. And so that's why it was basically a 12-hour storm, because then once it made it out over into the Atlantic, it didn't fare well and it fell apart pretty quickly. And so it's all about perspective. We're talking about how quiet it was, but when I was building that graphic today showing the past 2 seasons, how many named systems we'd already had, it's been incredibly active, incredibly early. And so things like Colin and things like Bonnie, everything we've had so far has been really unusual in areas that it formed and circumstances that it formed. And so I think we're just finally in for a classic season so far. We're just not seeing those early season and preseason named systems. And so if it continues to play out like a classic season, it'll be a slow buildup throughout the month of August and then bombs away by the time September rolls around.
Matt, what do you think?
Well, they stole the thunder there. I was going to mention, while we may be able to look at MJO and things like that, we're talking more about open water sort of things. Of course, if it comes off land and it does something like Colin did very quickly, or the one that was in the Western Gulf near Houston and Corpus Christi area, that one, they gave a 10% chance and then 20 and then very quickly 40. And it really looked like it was going to. It had some low level structure, but it didn't have everything. So that one was a decaying area of storms that came out from land into the open water, almost formed into something, but didn't quite do so. But Colin was successful. So that's what makes our job difficult sometimes, is we can look at the overarching thing and go, well, all of these oscillations of different things are pointing to this. And then something could just come out from land and be like, oh, well, there goes the forecast for the season, if it does that multiple times.
Our featured meteorologist, Matthew Wine, joining us from WDHN in Dothan, Alabama. Matthew, before we let you go, the floor is yours. What do you want Tracking the Tropics audience members to know as we enter now midway through July in the 2022 hurricane season?
There are a couple things, and this popped into my head. I know that everybody is on social media. We're all on Facebook and Twitter and these different things, and we look at YouTube videos, and you see some weather enthusiasts put things out there, and they may call themselves meteorologists, and I could care less if you have a degree or not. If you're good at what you do, you're good at what you do. But there are some that entirely hype things up, and they are willing to lie, and they're willing to just do things for views. Please go to somebody that you can truly trust. Don't go to those people that are just weather enthusiasts and are willing to go out there with just either a gut instinct or something to hype up the situation. And they'll put out these real long range forecasts saying, we're going to get something in this area in the Gulf within the next 384 hours. And it's like, we can't, 384 hours from now, we're not going to be able to pinpoint exactly the strength and something that's going to be there at that time. So I think as meteorologists, we need to reinforce that, hey, you got to trust those that are your local meteorologists that know what they're talking about. They're not here to scare you, but they're here to help you understand what you need to do to prepare. And our goal, obviously, never to hype up a situation.
How about Matthew with a hot take to end
hey,
the
man,
episode?
I'm all about hot takes and confrontation, baby. You got to set the record straight.
Preach, Jeff or Rebecca. Anything to add on that? Because that's something that we don't really ever get to talk about here on Tracking the Tropics. Just about how, of course, you as meteorologists have the certifications necessary to go on air and to talk to people about potentially, life-threatening situations, especially when it comes to severe storms. So, anything you want to touch on there that Matthew was just talking about?
Rebecca, anything?
Well, I think that this is a conversation that you and I have all the time because there is so much information that's so readily available right now. It used to be considered really irresponsible to show a forecast that was, 144 hours out or show a 14-day forecast. It would be really irresponsible to go on the air and say, hey, there might be a hurricane in 14 days here. But now people are seeing it everywhere. I feel like you and I share the same opinion that we have to talk about it and we have to address, I know you've seen on Facebook, someone posted this video of this forecast model, but I really don't think that's going to happen, and here's why. So it's just applying our level of expertise to information that people are already getting in from sources like that.
And Rebecca and I have had this conversation too, and this is a little bit of inside baseball, but sometimes we talk about, well, should we start talking about this situation a week and a half, 2 weeks out? It's a little early. That, like Rebecca said, in the meteorological community, it's very frowned upon to do stuff like that. But at the same standpoint, we also understand that if you don't get it from us, someone else is going to post it and likely post it irresponsibly. I'd rather address a situation before the hypesters, who are just looking to put clickbait out there. I'd rather address it first and properly. This way people understand the context, and I think Rebecca would probably agree with that too. So I'm starting to shift the way that I do stuff now to try to head them off, the hypesters off at the pass, so that I can give you the real information. Hey, you're about to see this, 15-day hurricane, which is a Cat 5 right over Florida. That's not going to happen, everybody. Don't listen to the hype. Right, Matthew?
Yes, absolutely. So it stinks that that's something that's now part of the job, but I'm glad that there are people out there that absolutely love weather. Sometimes I just wish that they would tone it back some. And if they don't necessarily have the expertise, lean on those that are the experts instead of, getting monetized videos because they just put out some crazy things.
Well, we here are not going to, of course, play into the hype. We're always going to keep it real with you folks and do so with the weather experts, the meteorologists as part of Next Star Nation that we bring in, meteorologists from across the country in places, yes, including Dothan, Alabama, where our featured meteorologist today, Matthew Wine, chief meteorologist at WDHN, is joining us from. We really appreciate your time, Matthew, and appreciate some of the great conversation that we had on this episode. Of course, as always, we've got meteorologists Rebecca Barry and Jeff Biradelli here with you live as well in your hurricane headquarters. Tracking the Tropics, everybody, is live every Wednesday, 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central, on whatever app, website, or social media platform that you're watching on. And if there's any tropical development that we feel that you need to know about, we can always go live at a moment's notice with additional episodes and additional coverage as necessary. So we'd like to thank you for watching here on Tracking the Tropics, powered by Handyman Roofing. For all of our team members, not just here, but across the country, we appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time here, folks, on Tracking the Tropics.
Thank you for watching Tracking the Tropics.